Every country in the world is in debt, so who exactly is lending the money? These debts will never truly be paid off. The United States currently owes more than $38 trillion, the highest figure in its history. The European Union owes around 14 trillion. Japan nearly 9 trillion. Even oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia or export giants like Germany and China carry enormous amounts of debt. If everyone owes money, then who is the creditor? This is where money, power, and history intersect. Nothing is as simple as it seems. Debt is not just a burden. It is the architecture of the modern world. Every war, every crisis, every rise and fall is built upon this invisible balance of debt and credit. If you trace the chain of creditors far enough, you encounter a harsh truth. The world owes no one, it owes itself. But that doesn't mean everyone benefits equally. To understand how we reached more than $315 trillion in global debt, we need to go back to the beginning. Centuries ago, the idea of national debt was not born on Wall Street, but in war. In 1694, England was at war with France, and its gold reserves were running out. The king turned to merchants for help. In exchange for perpetual interest payments backed by future taxes, they financed the war. To formalize this new arrangement, the Bank of England was created. It was a revolution. The state could now spend money it didn't yet have. In return, lenders received something priceless, the word of the state. That word became the government bond. It could be bought, sold, and transferred. France copied it, the Dutch refined it, the new power, the United States, used it to fund its westward expansion. National debt was no longer a sign of failure, but a measure of credibility. The ability to borrow became the power to rule. Empires once conquered lands for gold. Now they issued bonds to collect interest. When the wars ended, the balance sheet remained. 3 centuries later, debt became the world's dominant export. The United States owes $38 trillion, Japan more than 9 trillion, and global debt grows by $10 billion every single day. Every country borrows, every bank lends, every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pension funds, is both a debtor and a creditor. So how does this work? Let's start with the United States, because its debt is not just national, it's global. About half of that 38 trillion is owed not to other government agencies, but to investors. Roughly 2/3 of those investors are American banks, pension funds, investment funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself. The remaining third, about $9 trillion, is held by foreigners. Japan, with about $1 trillion, is the largest foreign creditor, followed by China with around 800 billion, then the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So when people say America owes China, it's true, but only about 2% true. The U.S. Treasury issues bonds. Banks and funds buy them. The Federal Reserve buys them back, creating new dollars in return. Americans pay taxes, those taxes pay the interest on the bonds, and that interest flows back into American retirement accounts. This isn't unique to America. Japan lends to the U.S. through Treasury bonds. The U.S. lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing nations through the World Bank. Developing countries, in turn, invest their foreign reserves in Western bonds, effectively lending to developed nations. Every country holds another's debt instruments. Every promise is backed by another promise. The continuation of this game depends on everyone continuing to play. Another crucial element is the market. Behind every government bond lies a network of hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks managing trillions in assets. They are the true arbiters of credit. They decide which nations can borrow cheaply and which must pay dearly to survive. When trust disappears, currencies collapse, governments fall, and entire economies can be restructured overnight. Democracy decides who governs, markets decide who survives. And at the heart of this order is the central bank. Central banks don't just manage debt, they create it. Every time the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys bonds, it creates new money in exchange. One balance sheet's liability becomes another's asset. Every dollar in circulation is a debt somewhere else. There is no such thing as money without debt. On every coin, every banknote, every digital dollar, the word credit is invisibly engraved. For years, this cycle has continued through trust. As long as investors believe governments will keep paying interest, the machine keeps turning. But what happens when trust breaks? We've seen it before. In 2010, Greece's government debt became unpayable. Bondholders panicked. Interest rates skyrocketed. The European Central Bank and the IMF stepped in. But the bailout came with austerity, tax hikes, spending cuts, and mass unemployment. For a generation, rescue meant sacrifice. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a national nightmare. In Sri Lanka, when the government ran out of foreign reserves to pay its external debt, fuel shortages and political collapse followed. When the system fails, the creditors suddenly become visible. The IMF, credit rating agencies, and the faceless bondholders who hold entire nations by the throat. And after the collapse, the same logic resumes. New loans replace the old debts are restructured, the system remains the same. Because in the 21st century, debt is not designed to be repaid, it is designed to be rolled over. Governments don't plan to pay off their debts. That's not a conspiracy, it's policy. When you or I borrow, repayment is expected. Governments work differently. They issue new bonds to pay the old ones. Economists call it refinancing. It's the rent of stability. The global economy now lives off that rent. Today, the financial system rests not on repayment, but on confidence. The United States will never repay its $38 trillion. It will roll it forever. Japan has been rolling its debt for decades, yet bond yields remain near zero. Investors don't expect repayment, they expect renewal. Why? Because government debt is the safest collateral on earth. U.S. Treasuries are seen not as liabilities, but as assets, the foundation of global markets. Pension funds hold them, banks use them as collateral, central banks treat them as money. The system is built on the assumption that governments will never fully pay off their debts, because if they did, the world would lose its most reliable financial instrument. Imagine if America somehow decided to pay all its debt. Banks and funds around the world would instantly lose their most stable asset. The supply of dollars would contract dramatically. Deflation and collapse would follow. Paying off the debt would destroy the very thing keeping the economy alive. That's why governments do the opposite. Debt becomes the heartbeat of capitalism, pulsing through every pension fund, every mortgage, every market in the world. So when politicians promise to balance the budget or eliminate national debt, they're selling an illusion. The goal isn't to eliminate debt, but to keep it payable and the system trustworthy. Because once confidence is lost, numbers stop mattering. Trust collapses, interest rates soar, and an economy built entirely on promises comes to a halt. That is the true secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to repay it. The plan was to make the world keep believing it would be repaid. The system rewards those who hold debt and punishes those who pay it off. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the same story scaled up from households to nations, from nations to the planet. Creditors are not villains. Debtors are not victims. They are two sides of the same engine. The problem is what happens when the engine runs out of fuel. When new borrowing can no longer catch up to the old, the question, who is the creditor, stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because at the top of this global pyramid, there is no single face to blame. Debt once meant bondage. Today, it means balance. But if that balance ever breaks, if trust shatters, the illusion ends and we remember what debt truly is, a promise that can't be kept forever. If this gave you a new perspective, please subscribe.